Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1166 brings an end to our foray into the God Valley incident and brings some of the focus of the Herald flashback back to Herald. And 1167 offers a huge swath of new lore and implications for the story at large. Lots of fun stuff to talk about in these chapters, so let's get into it. Starting with 1166, this chapter is titled New Stories, referencing all of the characters who would have their futures shaped by their involvement in this terrible event. We start off in the aftermath of the combination attack by Roger and Garp, with the two of them knocked unconscious and Xebec having returned to his normal human form, seemingly unable to move. Recall at the end of the last chapter, we saw Xebec's body being disfigured and torn apart from the combined attack, but it seems the regeneration associated with Domi Reversi has restored his body before wearing off, and we had suspected that there was a way to overcome the Domi Reversi transformation by defeating the enemy, as we saw Xebec surrounded by the corpses of his Davy clan a few chapters ago, and they all seem to have reverted as well. It seems a critical mass of Conqueror's Haki is enough to reverse this ability. As Xebec wonders if he'll make it out of this alive, Summers, Garling, and Maffy appear and come to take his life, but in classic Oda fashion, we don't actually get to see Xebec's death, as it is off-screened, with it only being implied by a splatter of blood. The rule of thumb is that unless we see the corpse in full, it's not necessarily a given that the person is actually dead. We've had similar scenes in the past, such as with Pound, where we saw Oven coming in with his blade from behind, and then the aftermath of the blood on the blade, only for it to turn out that Pound managed to survive. And I think we could have a similar situation here, especially with Rayleigh's response when asked about what happened to Rocks. He takes a pause, and then delivers the solemn answer. I don't think Rayleigh would be lying about Xebec's status, but I do think that it's possible for something else to have happened after Rayleigh and Gabon left. As everyone runs to escape, we see the island beginning to collapse upon itself, and we're shown incredible streaks of lightning splitting the sky overhead. Now, this doesn't seem like anything we saw from the destruction of Lelouch with the weapon that was powered by the Mother Flame, and I have to wonder if this is something that is being done by the Holy Knights themselves, as Garling did mention earlier in this flashback that God Valley will cease to exist when he was speaking to his children's mother, and that was before the Rocks and Roger Pirates even showed up on the island. In the spread of all the key characters that survived God Valley, we see a young Marshal D. Teach in Ares' arms, but their location is not really clear. Considering that Kuma sent them away with his powers, I'd figure they may have been sent to Sorbet, since his abilities are limited to places that he's been before. We also get this great sequence of the Roger Pirates finding Shanks in the treasure chest. Now, this entire page was actually conceived of years ago, as we first saw it as part of some sketches for One Piece Film Red. While the sketches are largely vague, there are some details that you can see that did not end up making it into the canon, such as Roger having his captain's hat. He would have this later on in his life, and this is just another piece of evidence to suggest that Oda had the broad strokes of these events planned out, but not necessarily all of the specifics. The news of the Rocks Pirates' defeat spread around the globe and was largely rewritten as the triumph of Garp the Hero. We first learned that God Valley was the reason Garp became known as the hero of the Marines back during the Wano arc, as explained by Sengoku, and had learned about Morgan's involvement in reframing the narrative back during Kuma's flashback. Garp is extremely displeased at the government just covering all of this up and making him the hero, a situation that is not too unfamiliar to us, as we saw a similar course of events when they covered up Crocodile's defeat and attributed all of that to Smoker, who was also adamantly against it. We get some nice bit of insight into Sengoku's psyche with the scene, as he acknowledges that the government and the Navy are so vast and large that it's easy for him to turn a blind eye to anything nefarious or unbecoming that is going on. This infuriates Garp, as he sees it as Sengoku being willing to bend a knee to the government just to further his own career, which explains why Sengoku was able to make his way all the way up to Fleet Admiral, in direct contrast to Garp refusing a promotion beyond Vice Admiral. This also helps to recontextualize what we've seen of Sengoku in the past, or I guess the future given how far back this flashback is taking place, as Sengoku had ordered Saul to stop questioning the Buster Call on Ohara. It's easy to read that as Sengoku just being an obedient government dog, and even believing in that genocide as something righteous, but it seems now that Sengoku may not have necessarily had the same principles as the organization that he was serving, but was just able to compartmentalize the injustice being done, with the justification being that he cannot action any change without being at the top of the ranks. We know that he does have a breaking point, however, as we saw at the end of the Marineford War. He deemed it absurd for the government to cover up the escape of the impelled down convicts, prompting him to ask for resignation, meaning that this was the moment he realized that no amount of rank within the Marines would allow him to actually uphold justice in the way that he thought fit. And while on the topic of the Marineford aftermath, we get a familiar face in the background here, as we see a younger Dr. Fishbonen. This was the Marine HQ doctor that we saw tending to Kobe after the war, who revealed that Kobe had unlocked Haki during that battle. His presence here creates a fun parallel between the pairs of Garp and Sengoku, and Kobe and Helmeppo, and while their personalities may not be one-to-one, it does follow that God Valley and Marineford were monumental parts of Garp and Kobe's lives, prompting them on their own paths of justice. We then swing back to Elbaf and find Loki wailing at the news of Rox's defeat, as he reminisces on another instance of him begging to join the crew, to which Rox declines, saying that he doesn't allow children on board, as if the parallel of Rox being Loki's Shanks figure was not apparent already. We learn that Loki believes Rox to be Nika, who from his perspective is a god of destruction. Recall that there were various conflicting accounts of what Nika was supposed to be across the people of Elbaf. Rox doesn't feel like that fits him well, seeing as how he intends on ruling the world, but thinks that Harold is capable given his power. The Galila is brought up once again, as Rox explains to Loki that Harold has the power to command them. This crucial bit of info being departed onto Loki has some serious implications and recontextualizes a lot of what we thought we knew. If the power Rox is referring to is the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf that has been passed down across these generations, it makes a lot of sense now why Loki would be willing to go to the lengths of killing Harold just to get his hands on that ability and follow in Rox's footsteps. Though I do think there is more to Loki killing Harold, and we know that Harold has not actually eaten the fruit at this point, at least before Loki was born, as we did see him swimming in the ocean. Rox explains that Harold refuses to ally with him due to reasons of love, which feels a bit vague here, as it's not clear if that's in reference to the love of a specific person, his people in general, or something else, but love has definitely been a recurring element across this arc, so I'm interested in seeing where this goes. Loki's flashback trails off, with Rox saying that he'll keep on coming back to ask for Harold's help as long as it takes, which is eerily reminiscent of his promise to return before Emu, and that previous line about how this is all the prelude to his life. All of this together makes me wonder about Loki's potential relationship with Blackbeard. If it is the case that Rox is dead, could his promise to return be carried out by his son, and would Loki ally himself with Blackbeard in order to carry out Rox's goals? Now, this chapter also gives us a quick glimpse of Dragon after his insubordination. It looks like he's been kept as a prisoner in one of the underground prison cells of Marine HQ. This is the first time we've seen the actual prison here, but this is likely where Ace was held before his execution after he was transferred from Impel Down. Dragon expresses that he's leaving the Marines and that he's disappointed in Garp, to which the Vice Admiral just solemnly expresses acknowledgement and drops him the key to the cell. I hope we do touch back on the two's relationship later in the series, as this is our first glimpse at any of sort of contact between the two. We know that they may have briefly communicated after the events of Logtown, but I do wonder how much they keep in touch now. Meanwhile, we find that Harold has been on a rampage after Rox's death and has been taking it out on other giants who terrorize humanity, blaming them for the continuation of their species' bad reputation, but also really taking out his own frustrations with himself, being unable to help his closest friend as he marched to his death. He returns to Elbaf and sets his sights on atoning for the sins of his people, and expresses his hope for Loki and Hyrule to lead Elbaf together after he's gone, as we are shown a scene here that we first saw a glimpse of back during chapter 1143 when Hyrule was contemplating ending Loki's life. And it's with this that we get the long-awaited scene of Harold ripping out his own horns, but the twist is that he's actually doing so at Marine HQ, presenting himself before the government in an act of commitment to his goal of bettering the relations between human and giant kind, even if it means that he must become a slave. This hits incredibly hard, especially after his whole fallout with Rox, who criticized Harold's dream of joining the government as allowing himself to become their war dogs, but it seems Harold is at the end of his limit now and is willing to take extreme measures if it means being able to join the people of the world in peace. And this takes us to chapter 1167, Ida's Sons. While I usually don't talk about the cover illustrations that are not cover stories, the one we see in this chapter may actually have some canon material, as it depicts Nojiko and Genzo fawning over a young cat who is stoning fish encyclopedia. This is of course very reminiscent of Nami's flashback, where she is seen being reprimanded by Genzo for stealing a book on navigation, and while we never actually see the bookstore owner or the bookstore in the source material, it seems we may be getting our first good glimpse at them here in this cover page. As for the chapter itself, we pick back up 5 years after the God Valley incident and find a 20-year-old Morgan's getting a report from someone speaking of a giant shadow appearing behind pirates that were attacking town. Elsewhere in Impel Down, a prisoner tells a story of how a ship was destroyed by a huge human being, and another reporter asks the fisherman about what he saw, wondering if they ended up in the Florian Triangle. Now, all of this does feel very reminiscent of the still yet to be disclosed shadows that we saw behind Thriller Bark at the end of that arc, but in truth, all of these sightings are in fact about Harold. The reporter that spoke to the fisherman seems to be a young Reuter, who was a news reporter that we saw in the Sabati Archipelago back during the Marineford arc. His name comes from an old data book, One Piece Blue, and it appears it's been given its official English spelling on his hat. Now, it seems after devoting himself to the world government in the last chapter, Harold has been working in the shadows, taking out various pirates for the government. This is pretty reminiscent of what we saw Kuma doing the few years before the start of the series, and Harold bisecting the ship echoes Mihawk slicing Krieg's Dreadnought Saber in two. All that to say, I wonder if Harold's service to the government was a predecessor to the warlord system, which, as far as we know, would not exist in this point in time. I've talked about this on the channel before, but all of the current current known information points to the warlord system coming into place around Roger's death or in response to the Great Age of Piracy. We are told that the remnants of the Rock's pirates began to rise in power in the coming decade, something that we actually first learned of back during Oden's flashback. In that panel, we saw Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido in the center, with what we presume to be Shiki on the left, and another obscured figure on the right in the back, who we may now be able to interpret as Wang Zhi, given their inclusion amongst the other four in this chapter. Interestingly, Wang Zhi appears to have a scar running across their face by this point in time, making me wonder if they ended up clashing with someone after they stayed back on Pirate Island instead of joining the crew on God Valley. And it seems this may be the last time we'll hear from the Rock's pirates in this flashback, as we skip a bit ahead to Roger becoming king of the pirates, and then his execution, bringing us to 24 years ago. We learn that in response to the Great Pirate Era, the Marines recruited several giants into their forces from around the world, in addition to John Giant and the other Elbaf giants that we saw had already been enlisted several years ago, as disclosed to us by Harold earlier in the flashback. Many of the giants that we see here would be seen as part of the Giant Squad later on during Marineford. After a decade of service, Harold is finally allowed entry into the Holy Land, and we find him within the Chamber of Power, which brings into question just how tall the ceilings in this room actually are. But more importantly, we get a rundown of how Holy Knight status works, more or less, as Harold is granted the status of Devoted Blade of God. If you recall, this is the status that Gunko held 38 years ago on God Valley. It seems there are 3 levels of contract with the Holy Knights, with this level being the lowest, known as the Surface Covenant. Above that is the Depths Covenant, and even higher, the Abyssal Covenant, 2 levels that are fully bound to God themselves. Harold questions what exactly they mean by God, but that answer is not readily available for him until he reaches that level of knighthood. Despite the secrecy, he's ecstatic at the opportunity to have Elbaf join the world, and this line from Saturn gives me pause when he mentions that the world would accept him at that point. While Harold is thinking the world refers to the people of the planet at large, I wonder if the elders are more specifically talking about Emu, who is referred to as the world by Zebek. Now, the motif of sea level running across the names of the covenants feels very heavy-handed, what with years of speculation surrounding Emu being the Sea Devil, and the recent resurgence of Davy Jones and his importance to the overarching history of the world, as he was said to have been cursed to a fate at the bottom of the sea. There are also similar figures, such as the original Vanderdecken, and when you think about it, our first in-universe nods to the idea of surface and deep sea did come from the start of the Fishman Island arc, when the crew descended into the depths of the ocean, where they were met with complete darkness and monsters beyond their imagination. Could Oda have really given us a glimpse of what would come at the end game of the story back at the beginning of the time skip? It makes complete sense for him to draw from the deep sea imagery and motifs, especially when a big part of Fishman Island's struggle has always been to combat the darkness of the ocean with the light of the sun. We could spend hours on this very topic, but I would be remiss not to mention the design signifying the contract. This is the same mark that we saw on Shanks' arm earlier in this flashback. At that time, we thought Shanks may have spent some years as a holy knight, which turned out to be mostly true, as we'll talk about shortly, but it seems he was also just a devoted blade of God, just like Harold. We have seen a more decorated version of the symbol on the armbands of Killingham and Summers, as well as the transponder snails that they use, so I would venture to guess that this is the next level up, though it is interesting that these are not tattooed on their arms like with Harold and Shanks, and I suppose it's still not confirmed that these are the marks that were referred to earlier in the arc that allowed them to travel through the abyss, but I think it's a pretty good theory at the moment. It was mentioned that there were 13 people that had the privilege of being bound by the Depths Covenant and the Abyssal Covenant. It's unclear to me if that includes the Elders, or is just something specific to the Holy Knights. The size of the Holy Knights as a military force is still unclear. If we go back and count the silhouettes that we saw in God Valley, you can make out 12 figures surrounding the podium, which may perhaps suggest that the Elders are not counted toward that number, or perhaps the 13 is only referring to the number of Depths holders, and the 5 Elders have the Abyssal contract. Anyways, the idea of these being contracts that bound them to Emu is similar to what we saw with Emu's diabolical covenant technique that transformed the giants into demons in exchange for their lifespan. It would follow that the recipients of the Depths Covenants are allowed the regeneration that we saw used by the Holy Knights and the Elders, and perhaps the Abyssal contracts allow the special mythological Zoan powers that we saw from the Elders. We then get introduced to Shangara, the Temple of the Knights of Gods in the Holy Land. This feels like it may be a nod to Shangri-La, the fictional paradise where its inhabitants live for hundreds of years, aging slowly, much like how the Elders in Gunko do not age at all. Harold pledges himself to the service of the Knights and is allowed to travel freely so long as he keeps the transponder snail on him. Becoming a pawn of the Holy Knights recontextualizes the invitation extended to Loki that we saw at the start of the arc, as at that time it felt a bit random or unexpected that a non-CD was being allowed entry into these ranks, but it makes a lot more sense considering Loki's father was already in the service. We move forward in time 4 years and find Harold visiting Fishman Island, which makes sense considering that he traveled between the Paradise half and New World half of the Grand Line fairly often for his work. Now, Harold had met Neptune as a baby around 70 years ago, as we first learned earlier in this flashback when he was relaying his adventures to the villagers of Elbaf, and it seems they've developed a friendship since then. In the midst of their discussions about fatherhood, Neptune mentions that his daughter is prophesied to be born in the future and offers her hand to Loki. They speak about this as if it's a match made in heaven, and Herald teases Neptune about his Shaggy daughter. This adds a ton of fuel to the theory that Shirahoshi is actually Shaggy, the person on the other end of the transponder snail that Loki has been speaking with. The idea of Neptune's daughter being Harry or Shaggy first came up during Odin's flashback when Roger spoke about his future daughter in the same way, and combined with the polite manner of speaking and timid nature that Shirahoshi has, many connected the dots of the possibility of Shirahoshi being Loki's friend. This was even bolstered by the dialogue of some Sea Kings from that flashback who mentioned the birth of two sovereigns. Many initially took this to be about Luffy and Shirahoshi, but it makes a lot more sense for it to actually be about two royals. Now, the two have never met each other or seen each other in person, but according to Loki, it feels like they've been friends for a very long time, which would contradict what Shirahoshi said about not having been able to speak to anyone but her companion shark Megalo back during the Fishman Island arc. However, it could be that Loki is speaking figuratively and is referencing his fated engagement to her, with perhaps Herald having told Loki about her even before she was born. The events that Shaggy described to Loki about what she just went through echoes a lot of what happened to her at the Reverie, and Loki's disdain for her attackers is aligned with his hatred for the Celestial Dragons. Not only that, her last communication revealed that she would not be able to speak for a while, which led many to speculate if Blackbeard had come to Fishman Island to abduct her or something along those lines, now that Caribou is around to relay that information about the ancient weapons. But the more interesting aspect from that exchange, in my opinion, is that Oda explicitly made sure to have Luffy, Sanji, and Zoro leave the scene before Shaggy calls, perhaps indicating that they would be familiar with her voice. The whole Shaggy Hoshi theory is a really fun one, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it gain a bit more traction with this chapter. There are some contrivances at play for it to really work, but I think it's still plausible. Let me know if you think otherwise. Herald returns to Elbaf, and we find Saul asking for permission to settle on the island, and we get the scene of him being tasked to open the school as stated earlier in the arc. We then skip ahead 5 years to the night Fisher Tiger freed the slaves of Mary Joie, first mentioned by Boa Hancock all those years ago during the Amazon Lily arc, and we see that he was aided by a mysterious swordsman who we soon realize is actually Shanks, as he helps break Fisher Tiger's collar. Now, the Celestial Dragon slaves often have explosive collars, meaning that Shanks may be employing an advanced application of armament hockey here to remove the collar without detonating it, making him the third user of internal destruction that we've seen in the series, with the other two being Rayleigh and Luffy. But there is a continuity error here, as Fisher Tiger would not be in chains at this point in time. If you'll recall, during the Fishman Island arc's flashback, we learned that Fisher Tiger had returned home 16 years ago after having spent time as a slave. From Hancock's account, we learned that Tiger had scaled the Red Line with his bare hands and freed the slaves a year later, meaning the scene we get in this chapter is a bit off. Now, to keep it within continuity, we could take it as Fisher Tiger having been enslaved once again and then breaking free once more, but I think this may just be a mistake on Oda's part, which is totally fair given that these timelines are really confusing. The next day, we find the Holy Knights discussing the escape, where we learn they suspect it may have been an inside job. And funny enough, in that same breath, we are introduced to Saint Figurlin Shanks, who of course was the one who helped Fisher Tiger. It seems Shanks has returned to the Holy Land under the guise of wanting to get realigned with his heritage. We see him put on this arrogant act, trying to play the part of a Celestial Dragon, almost as if overcompensating. He's incredibly uptight, but reveals his hand to us when he asks Samrock to tell him more about the Holy Land. From the conversation between Herald and the Elders, it seems that those with the Shallow Covenant are not privy to the deeper secrets of the world, including Emu, which may mean that Shanks has not been acting in the present day with the knowledge of Emu's existence in mind, as some may have wondered. And him being so inquisitive here and putting off this facade makes me think that this is all part of a plan for him to learn more about what the government is actually doing. This could perhaps even have been prompted by what Roger told him privately back during Oden's flashback, which resulted in Shanks being seen in tears after. Many have speculated that Shanks was told about his true origins as a Celestial Dragon. Also, I think it's helpful to get a sense of Shanks' timeline to get a better understanding of the scene. 24 years ago, Shanks was seen at Roger's execution and parted ways with Buggy after the two have a falling out over their views on piracy. 2 years later, Shanks would end up attempting to recruit Yasopp in the East Blue, but he would not join until 3 or so years later after Usopp was born 19 years ago. It's in that year that the Red Hair Pirates come across a young Uta, and the next known event is what we see in this chapter, with him returning to the Holy Land 15 years ago. So Shanks already having his crew by now should further reinforce the idea that this is all part of some sort of reconnaissance mission. Also, we see Shanks has his eye bandaged up, meaning that this is fresh off his fight with Blackbeard, who gave him a scar, meaning that Shanks may have clashed with the Whitebeard Pirates at some point recently. Herald can't help but feel like he's met Shanks before, to which Shanks immediately denies to prevent his cover from being blown. This scene is a bit interesting, as we have not actually had Herald come in contact with Shanks prior to this moment. We did just kind of skip over 20 years in this chapter, so I can imagine there being a point in time where Herald came across Roger's crew, but perhaps that's being saved for a later flashback. Also, it's likely this scene that Shanks was referring to at the start of this flashback when he was speaking to Rayleigh about having met Harold and Mary Joie, but not being able to talk about something in particular there. It's still not clear what exactly Shanks wanted to talk to Harold about. At that time, many wondered if it could have been about the Nika fruit, as there was still speculation that it was the legendary fruit of Elbaf, but I think it could have also just been about the secrets of the government in general, or maybe even Harold's relationship to Rox, especially given that he's fresh off his battle with Blackbeard. One last thing about the sequence is that Shanks' sword looks a bit different. We've spoken a lot on this channel about how he may have had different blades throughout his life, as it is not the same across his appearances in Chapter 1, Chapter 234, and Chapter 838. The sword he uses now, known as Griffin, first appears in 234 during the present day of the pre-time skip, but the blade he uses in Chapter 1, which takes place 12 years ago, is seemingly different from what he has here in this chapter, 3 years prior to that. This could all just be nothing but inconsistencies, of course, but I do wonder if he would end up receiving a special blade like Griffin from his family here, and if that blade would have powers like we saw with Shamrock's Cerberus. It's also this year that Ida has strangely fallen ill. Hirunden has taken out to sea by this point in order to search for a doctor alongside his crew, and Loki is showing his affection in his own way by hunting animals for her to eat. However, the twist of the knife in this chapter comes at the end as we learn that Ida was actually poisoned by the relatives of Loki's mother, Estrid, who are so envious of Ida potentially becoming queen that they'd resort to this kind of extreme. We suspected that Estrid was not exactly top shelf material that she was being presented as, and it seems even more clear now given the cloth that she's cut from. This revelation enrages Loki, who has grown to love Ida as his own mother throughout these years, realizing that she is the closest thing to a mother that he's ever had. And the chapter ends with Loki raising the Brewers village and potentially even killing off his mother's side of the family, almost finishing the job of ridding himself of every connection he had to Estrid after he killed her brother years ago. Personally, this development is really exciting, as I enjoyed Loki as a narrative force, but this chapter really helped to make me feel for him as a character with the capacity for growth, and it should be expected as Oda tends to flesh out his characters in a major sort of way. It is a bit sad that Loki will go on to lose Ida this year and his father the following year, as we are now 1 year away from when we started this flashback on the day of Harold's death 14 years ago. It feels like this flashback is coming to an end, as I'm starting to think that we'll not go much further beyond Harold's death and instead revisit Loki's time at sea later on after we finish up with the present day situation on Elbaf, but I'd love to be proven wrong. Anyways, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for sticking around. Let me know what you thought of these chapters, and if you're new to the channel or enjoyed the video and want to show your support, consider subscribing so you can get all of my videos as soon as they come out. The rest of my manga breakdowns can be found in the playlist in the description, and that said, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.